only looked at her. His eyes picked up the light from the plant pods, making them glow a freakish purple. Light flashed again and the world shook with the thunder. She tried to get away from his gaze, but those eyes kept watching her. 1,000 deaths echoed in her mind. The rain sheeted down around them, falling in heavy drops from the leaves above. Kira twisted again and he jerked her straight. She cried out in pain. She wouldn't end up dead like all the others. She had to survive. Of all the colonists, she'd been the only one to make it this far. She could die now. Kira launched herself at him. Her nails just missed his face, but she was free and running before he could react. Bare feet slapped against the ground as she ran. There was no sense to the world. Everything was dark, but her instincts had taken over. In the dim light she could just make out footholds. Kira's breath burned in her throat and she hugged her arm to her chest. Her feet flew across the ground. The forest was a green strobe light. Kira could focus. The trees stood out in stark relief against the darkness of the storm. Blue trunks jumped out at her, their gnarled arms grasping and reaching. She clumsily dodged a thorn, slipping in the mud and slamming into the trunk of a sap tree. Its bulbous body loomed up against the sky outlined by lightning, a giant towering over her. Kira screamed and ran the opposite direction. The fear was overwhelming. She had never been so afraid, so sure she was going to die. Vines slapped against her face, catching her arms and scraping across her skin. Plant pods and lantern flowers exploded in light as she thrashed through them. She could breathe. Memories long suppressed choked her. One moment she was running through a tropical storm and the next she was stumbling along with the sounds of the attack in her ears. She was stupid, so stupid. How could she ever have thought that confronting him would solve anything? Her caution had kept her alive. She was stronger than this. She was the only human still alive. She was currently on the way to being dead. The ground was slick with mud and leaf clutter. Her feet kept slipping. Every breath was a dagger between her ribs. Her shoulder was a mass of agony. Everything ached on her but she could stop running. She could A pitiful keening sound filled her ears and made her skin crawl. Horrified, she realized the sound came from her. She stumbled, gasping for air. He wouldn't catch her. She wouldn't let him. Her feet were cut and throbbing, but Kira kept running. Everything ached. She was on her last reserve, and she could feel her body giving out. Her legs were tingling and numb. Her sides were spasming. There wasn't enough air in the entire forest to stop the fire in her chest. Water was everywhere, dripping in her face, stinging against her skin. She was drowning on land. Kira searched through the trees and rain for the mountain, her hair throwing water into her eyes and sticking to her face. The forest disappeared into a gray sheet of water and the mountain was invisible. She stumbled again as her knee gave out. It slammed into a root and she pitched forward with a startled grunt. Blue bark jumped out at her, she threw her hand out and caught herself just above a thorn. Her palm slid along the jagged edge and she pushed off as hard as she could. Blood ran down her hand, dripped off her fingers. The thorn split down the center and vomited needle thorns out. She covered her head. Her palm stung where the poison had touched it, but the cut wasn't deep. It was strangely bright, a light crimson against the whiteness of her skin. She flicked her fingers and pushed herself to the side. The needles fell around her. Some sticking into her forearms. Most went over her head. Kira pulled them out as quickly as she could and pushed herself up. Her leg from the knee down was momentarily numb. It throbbed uselessly, making her slow. She had to keep running. She could already feel the poison numbing her fingers. Soon it would work its way through her arms, to her shoulders, to her heart. Kira shuddered, her movements becoming more and more sluggish. She staggered between the trees. She was going to die. Kira was going to die just like all the others, hunted, crying, and pathetic. She had to get up. She had to keep going. Her knee was a dead weight, but she forced herself to keep moving. Each step was easier. Each step left her waiting to die. Thunder crashed again and she started. The world was lit briefly in white light, and she saw him running next to her, long legs keeping pace. He was watching her, his blue-gold eyes following her disjointed movements. She couldn't look away. She didn't want to look at him. Why had she ever thought to prove her courage? He gave a ghost of a smile. Then, she slipped on a fallen frond and hit her head. Everything vanished. Chapter 3. A drum. At first, Kira thought the pounding rhythm was a drum. As the darkness slowly began to fade, she realized it was her heartbeat. Kira kept her eyes closed. It took a few moments for the pounding to lessen. Slowly her senses returned to her. Everything ached, her knee throbbed in time with her head. The kneecap felt massively larger than it should. She worked her way up her body, silently cataloging her injuries. From the smell of the air, she was somewhere in the forest. There was no lingering scent of sulfur, instead, the air was light, almost peppery. She kept her breath steady, careful not to move. Her right palm felt crusted. The center burned from the base of her fingers to the top of her wrist. The hand would be useless for a while, then, with a gash that long. Thunder rumbled above her and she stifled the urge to wince. Breathe in. Breathe out. The pain receded and she worked her way up from her wrist. The skin there felt tender, but the fire on her arm was more worrying. Kira tried again to remember what happened, but her mind drew a blank. How had she gotten so many needles in her? She easily recognized the familiar burning sensation, but it was the strongest she'd ever felt. It reached tendrils of heat up her arm, already coiling into her shoulder. Thunder cracked again and a stray breeze brushed her face. It smelled of rain and cinnamon. Kira swallowed. She had been captured. Everything was over. Lightning flashed again, blinding even against her closed eyelids, and her breath caught in her throat. So her nightmare had been reality. She could feel her left arm throbbing uselessly beside her, the joint still out of place. Needles from running into the thorn tree. Torn knee from falling. She turned her head slightly and a gasp escaped. The pain shot up the back of her skull and she fought to steady her breathing again. With the other injuries, she had had a slight chance of escape. A concussion left her completely open. Resigned. Kira focused instead on her prison. The sounds of rain were distant and hollow sounding, so she was somewhere deep. Other than the rain, the room was silent. Slowly, she opened her eyes. She squinted, trying to see what little of her surroundings she could in the dark. Lightning flashed, searing her eyes. She closed them and waited for the world to stop spinning. In that brief moment, her worst fears had been confirmed. Walls towered above her on both sides, the sky just barely visible through branches above her. You reawake. The voice was deep, fluid sounding. Her breath caught in her throat and she bit her lip. Survival demanded she run, but her body could hardly move. She opened her eyes slightly, searching the darkness for the origin of the voice. The words were very clearly English, a strange English that she'd heard before somewhere. The shadows were too deep. She couldn't see her own hand, let alone someone else. The ceiling was briefly lit again, branches tangled overhead. Disappearing into a thick blanket of green. Lightning filtered through, leaving little patches of white across her nose. White spots danced across her vision, obscuring any chance she had of seeing her capture or her escape. Kira sighed and stared upwards again. Little puffs of green drifted down every now and then. She watched one as it floated down to settle on her nose. Don't move. A black shape moved across her face and gently picked the leaf off her nose. She watched the fingers move up and away. Her head throbbed when she tried to follow it into the darkness and she grimaced. His voice had been close. She closed her eyes, willing the pain away. What was he waiting for? A shape bobbed into view overhead. Blue-gold eyes traveling from her head down her body. I am surprised. I didn't think a human would be so durable, oh, shit. Kira was up and against the wall of the tree before she could think. White fireworks of pain exploded across her vision and she blacked out. Asterisk 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 asterisk. The drums beat against the inside of her skull. Kira licked dry lips and slowly opened her eyes. She was still propped up against the wall. Her focus came back more quickly this time and she searched the darkness for the alien man. She could just make out a darker shadow in front of her. She flinched, then grabbed her head with a ragged gasp. Oh my fucking god. The shadow man backed up slowly. Kira watched him through watering eyes, relieved. Still, nothing fit. She propped her elbow on her good knee and held her head in her hand. He squatted a few yards away, the lightning illuminating him every few minutes. Kira swallowed and forced herself to show the same indifference. His eyes were narrowed and his dagger was out, but he made no more towards her. The poison was already fast at work. She tried to flex her injured hand. Nothing happened. Startled, she ventured a look down, fighting the dizziness. Black blood seeped slowly from the wound. Kira grimaced. Of course the hand was numb. The thorn and all its defenses had sliced it open. Carefully, she pulled the wounded hand into her lap. The man shifted and she returned her eyes to him. Her pulse raced, waiting. Every defense she had was gone, yet he didn't move. His marks slowly began to brighten, the light catching in his eyes and bathing the ground around him in dim blue light. She took a steadying breath and met his gaze. "What do you want from me?" He flipped the knife between his fingers. The sight of 6 fingers unnerved her further. He followed her gaze and stilled the knife. "What did you build?" She licked dry lips and said nothing. He watched her, his thumb rhythmically rubbing the hilt of the knife. He smiled slightly and flipped it. "What did you build?" he repeated. Lightning reflected off the barest hint of fang and chills broke out along Kira's arms. The blood rushed to her face. He cooled didn't break her that easily. He frowned and sat back on his heels, marks lightening to a powdery blue. Kira looked him over. She had never seen him before now, she realized. He wasn't one of her usual tormentors. He sighed. "I know you can understand me." She flinched as he leaned forward. His eyes watched her, the blue-gold irises catching the light. "Tell me, what did you build?" Kira curled her lip. "And if I don't tell you, stupid human?" The man stood and stared down at her. "It's a simple question. I need the answer." She frowned and sucked in a breath. The poison had reached her chest. It was slowly getting harder to breathe. "Mine was a simple question, too. What if I don't tell you?" She met his gaze, eyes steely with determination. Something was off about him. She could hardly think past the pressure in her head and chest, but something kept her quiet. "Why do you need an answer so badly?" The man smiled briefly. "Amazing. Even in the face of death, you refuse to give in." He shook his head and walked to the far side of the tree, his movements jerky and disjointed in the lightning flashes. "I wonder how long you'll hold out." He settled against the wall and flicked something behind him. A minty green light lit the cavern, its light illuminating the bulbous body of the tree. Thick walls bowed outward and Kira followed the green lace up. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to compose herself. The green light twisted its way from the floor to the top branches, an intricate web of fungus. The sap tree was huge. There was no way she was getting out. Gritting her teeth, she looked at her capture. She swallowed, her mouth dry with pain. He frowned and leaned forward, fingers sepaled before him. "You have about 20 minutes of consciousness left. Can you afford to ignore my question?" Kira snorted and winced as the world shivered before her. She rested her head against the wall and waited for the pounding to slow. "I have no reason to answer you," she hissed, wrapping her good arm around her chest. His eyebrows rose. "There is nothing good about you people. I know how this ends." She gasped and curled forward against her knee. Fireworks exploded across her vision again, but the pain in her chest was worse. The man stayed silent, watching her agony. She raised her gaze and spat. "Either way, I die," he smiled coldly. "So you understand the situation. What did you build?" he repeated. His eyes bored into her. She wrinkled her nose, body crippled by the poison. She took shallow breaths, trying to keep conscious. "This will all be easier if you tell me," he said. Kira snorted, then gasped against the wall of pain. His calm diplomacy was irritating. She straightened slowly against the wall, fighting the scream welling up. His eyes narrowed at her expression. "Easier for you or for me?" He grinned fairly, running his hand through his hair. "Oh, much easier for you." Warily, she watched him. The silence grew. Finally, Kira cleared her throat. "Time's running out. I don't plan on talking to you, so are you going to kill me like a man or let the poison do the job for you?" Her voice broke and she coughed. A vice tightened around her throat, invisible fingers cutting off the air slowly. He snorted. "Kill you." She shifted and barely nodded. "Diplomacy isn't one of you people's strong suits." She wrinkled her lip. "Or are you really a coward?" He shook his head and stood. "How amusing." Kira's sneer faded. "And how do you figure that exactly? Why are you toying with me?" He shrugged. "No one is toying with anyone. If you answer my question, everything will be over. His gaze shifted to her. I won't kill you. Kira laughed softly and rolled her eyes. All this for a question. His face hardened. I was wondering the same thing. He leaned forward and ran a finger down the length of his bowstring. It sent chills down her spine. You will answer my question. What did you build? Kira glanced at him then looked away. She didn't have much longer. The bands on her chest were growing steadily tighter. Her head throbbed. Kira blinked, trying to keep the black waves at bay. She briefly closed her eyes, steadying herself. If she stalled enough, she'd be dead before he could get anything from her. For the first time, she resented her immunity to the poison. If she hadn't been so clumsy back then, she'd already be out of her misery. He hissed in annoyance, bringing her attention back to him. Answer me. Kira refused to look at him. Out of the corner of her eye she watched him. He sat against the far wall, legs crossed before him and hands braced on his knees. His marks swirled an angry blue, the light blending with the glowing fungi. He scowled across at her. She looked away quickly. The man carried himself like someone used to giving orders. Kira took a shallow breath, trying to organize her thoughts. Clearly he was someone of importance. Her eyes slid back to him, narrowed in suspicion. Why should I tell you? If I tell you, then you'll kill me. He grinned fairly again, eye teeth glinting in the eerie glow. It's sounding more and more attractive. He stood, muscles rippling with the movement, and his marks faded altogether. The light from the fungus gave him an eerie glow, an eclipse before an emerald sun. His shadow blurred, the edges bleeding into green, and Kira blinked. Shit, his grin deepened. You have about 10 minutes left. Are you feeling it now? She glared at him, trying to see him through her failing eyesight. I am not a fool. She snapped, voice cracking. She took a wheezing breath and leaned her head back against the tree. If I tell you, I die. If I don't tell you, I still die. I already told you that I wouldn't kill you, however I could always put you out of your misery. You seem convinced I'll do it either way. She flinched at the twang of his bowstring as he pulled it over his shoulders. His voice dripped with sudden derision. After all, I am an alien. What virtue would I have? She closed her eyes. Her 10 minutes was quickly slipping away. The liquid fire had burned away to a steadily growing agony. Every nerve felt like it had exploded. She chuckled weakly. I am the only alien here. And I'll take my chances with the poison. Her breaths came in short gasps and she bit back a cry. I have a better idea. I tell you, and you help me. Deal. She tilted her head, listening. Help you. His fingers ran across the bowstrings again, the sound giving her chills. The seconds stretched. Finally he grunted, his bow tapping against the floor. It is a deal. Now his voice was suddenly closer and Kira recoiled, inhaling at the pain of movement. He sighed, sitting heavily. Kira pulled herself tighter into a ball. His blatant noise-making was a relief, but entirely confusing. He sighed and Kira slowly turned to face him. Now, tell me. Each breath ripped through her body. Kira gritted her teeth. I was building a fish trap. The effort of speaking left her dizzy. The man grunted. Why would you build a trap? Kira tried to swallow. Her mouth felt full of cotton. I had to survive. Another grunt met her words and she frowned. Someone kept messing. She cringed forward as her muscles spasmed. Gasping for air, she stared blindly at the floor. He waited patiently for the spell to pass. After a few moments, she relaxed against the wall again. Someone kept messing with my land traps. Even us humans have to eat. She tried to swallow again, her throat sticking. Fish were a more dependable source, yes, but the man shifted, something scraping across the floor. She heard a light tapping and realized he was tapping his knee. Why would you want to catch the children of Vitastami? She frowned, her head rolling to the side. Who? He pushed himself to his feet. Vitastami, the Sky Mother. She rules over the sky and the waters and the earth. He paced back and forth, footsteps rhythmic against the fading storm. Why would you want to catch them? She gave a ghost of a smile. I didn't know that they were. She lurched forward again, breathing ragged. She bit down on her lip, trying to keep the screams at bay. If she could hold out just a little bit longer, he would help her. She dug her nails into her forearms and forced herself to continue talking. I didn't know that they were the children of your goddess. I am sorry, she shuddered slightly, picturing the bulging eyes and gaping jaws. They were the only way I would survive. He said nothing. Kira lifted her head, desperate to hear where he was. Her hearing faded for a moment with the movement and panic rose. Then she heard the tapping again. You wonder why we kill you. He muttered, standing still. Her senses were rapidly failing now. The pain had hit the point of unbearable and was quickly being replaced by numbness. Any moment now, she would be unconscious. She didn't need a native to tell her that she wouldn't wake up from it this time. I told you. She ground out. Now it's your turn. Help me. His arms slid behind and under her. The warmth penetrating the foggy haze of the poison. She jerked in surprise as he picked her up. Her head flopped against his chest. The sound of his heart beat against her ear, a strangely soothing sound. I promised I wouldn't kill you. I never promised I could save you. Her eyes flew open, unable to see but shocked all the same. He sighed and set her gently down. At this point, Baleina, nothing could save you. Even if I could. I am not sure I would. ***********************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************Light filtered down over her in little patches of gold. She blinked crusty eyes but didn't move to get up. The air smelled differently than it usually did. It smelled like cinnamon and nutmeg and earth instead of sulfur and stone. Her arms and shoulders and hips ached in places she'd forgotten existed. Above her, dust motes float lazily in the sunbeams. The room was quiet, devoid of any sound save the faintest rustling of leaves. She frowned, closing her eyes again. The surf was missing and the rocks were gone. Where was she? You re-awake. Good, the voice was gruff but musical. She tensed and held her breath. The events of the past night came back. She bit the inside of her cheek, thinking. Had he changed his mind then? She had survived somehow. Kira took a steadying breath and sat up. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the waves of pain or the throbbing headache. Neither came. Surprised, she reached up to touch the back of her head. There was a little bump but nothing more. She stuck her arms out, inspecting both sides. All the bumps from the needle thorns had faded to little red pin pricks, and her left shoulder moved easily again. Goosebumps ran up her arms. She sat up a little straighter and slowly turned her right hand over. What the hell? The gash from the thorn had stitched itself together, the pink of healing showing along the edges. Something moved and she jerked her head up to meet those unnerving eyes. How long was I out? She demanded. He stepped into the light and squatted down across from her, long hands resting on his knees. The sunlight played across the flat plains of his face. 5 days and 5 nights. He watched her carefully, waiting for something. Why didn't I die? Did you change your mind? She kept her voice distant, remembering his final words. His eyes narrowed and the markings began to glow faintly. They had been almost as black as his skin, she realized, a perfect camouflage. Vitastami decided that you should live. Her eyebrows rose incredulously. He paused again and she realized he was testing her. She stayed quiet, deciding to wait him out. Her mind raced as their look lingered. There had to be a scientific explanation. Finally, she groaned and crossed her legs in front of her. Try that on me again, please. How exactly am I alive right now? His mouth twitched down and he frowned slightly. You drank of her and you didn't die. He said, voice clipped. Okay, so I drank your. He looked away in irritation and pointed next to her. Her eyes shifted to a depression in the wood. The water reflected her face serenely and she sat back. You've got to be kidding me, his lips twitched. I wish I was. You drank the water and you live. He looked just as shaken as she did. An ebony hand twisted uncomfortably around the grip on his bow. Now you have to go back to the mountain and stay there. He pushed himself to his feet and stared down at her. She squinted against the sunlight and shaded her eyes with her hand. He frowned. Or maybe not even there. She laughed. I didn't die cleanly like you'd hoped. She guessed. His frown deepened but he didn't turn away. I should have known that you would be difficult, Kira snorted. I make a habit of it. Now that I've survived and you redone with me, though, why shouldn't I go back to the mountain? She leaned back carefully, waiting for the usual pain after the poison. It didn't come. There were the aches and bruises from sleeping on the floor, but that was it. She flexed her fingers and rolled her neck, taking a moment to enjoy being alive. And explain to me again why I am not dead. I feel great. He squatted suddenly in front of her. She sucked in a breath and he shifted uncomfortably. She forced herself to relax, but his discomfort remained. A lock of hair fell across his face, giving him a rakish look. Vitastami saved you, girl. This, one long-fingered hand gestured to the tree, is the place for captives. It is for traitors and liars and idiots. She pulled away from his gaze and looked at the tree again, slightly offended. He caught the feeling and sighed. You weren't supposed to live, especially with your condition. No one lives long here unless they get out or Vitastami decides they will live. He was saying. At least, that's what I am assuming. No one has ever survived the Risvati. His eyes shifted back and forth, searching for something in hers. No one, he repeated. Abruptly, he stood and began to pace. She watched him, mulling over his words. No one had ever survived this prison chamber. She rubbed her shoulder thoughtfully. It had to be luck. He certainly hadn't done anything to help her out, and he had obviously planned on her dying. Kira tried to remember. When had she drunk anything? Not once did she remember waking. Disturbed, she stared upwards into the soft green light. The snowflake leaves drifted lightly down, light escaped through places where the leaves were thin, but even those spears of light were tainted by the green of the leaves. Kira jumped as he sat down in front of her. This does solve a problem, though. She stared at him. He grinned suddenly and propped his chin on his hand, elbow on his knee. Yes, this solves a lot, that I've been divinely ordained to live. She said. He ignored her sarcasm. The sunlight softened his face as he thought. Kira sighed and propped her own cheek on her hand. With a start, she realized that she was no longer afraid of him. Cautiously, she allowed herself to really look at him. He brushed back the wayward hair. Blue-gold eyes lost in thought. Aside from the obviously alien phosphorescence and double irises, he could have been human. She straightened and glanced away, feeling the heat creep up her face. He would have been stunning as a human. He seemed to sense her discomfort and, looking up, grinned. I suppose it doesn't look too good from your side, does it? No shit. She stared intently at the wall behind him, fighting to regain her composure. He grinned, teeth bright against the blackness of his skin. May I explain? He leaned forward slightly and held out his hand. Kira eyed it warily. His hand curled into a fist before dropping into his lap. I suppose you rewrite. He tapped his knee thoughtfully, then shrugged. I never wanted to kill you. Kira snorted. He grimaced. I wouldn't believe me either. The second night I saw you. I heard a patrol nearby. Even if you used the cover of the storm, they would have found you. He sighed ruefully. I had to take you, and I am sorry, but they continue you alive, they continue I am alive. Who? And why? Kira watched him out of the corner of her eye. What would he care if some other native found her? He scratched his chin sheepishly. I told the council 3 months ago that you were dead. 3 months, that was when the sabotage started. Kira sat up and glared at him. So you were the one messing with my traps. He winced but didn't deny it. Gah. You coward. Trying to starve me to death instead of killing me like a man. She snapped. His marks swirled a stormy blue as his face twitched in annoyance. Your continual doubt of my manhood is rather irritating. Kira flushed, but crossed her arms defiantly. Is it manly to hide like that? Her words stung him and she gave a short laugh. I don't think I was the one hiding that night. He looked her up and down, then laughed. She watched him in confusion. Well said. Baleina. As to my sabotage, you seem to be just fine for all my attempts to starve you. She quirked an eyebrow, unimpressed. His smile grew. I like to think I am a better hunter than that. If I wanted you to starve, you would have that very first month. He shook his head, all humor gone. Be glad Vitastami saved you. Otherwise, I would have been forced to kill you this time. Kira shivered at the truth behind his words. His eyes lingered on the pit in the floor, the water still reflecting the sunlight. Honestly, I am not sure even your divine ordainment can keep you alive. Let me think. He pushed himself up, long fingers splayed against the gray wood of the tree. Marks swirled and danced across the skin, curling around all 6 fingers. Kira shivered again. This time from the alienness of him. He paced back and forth, mumbling and muttering to himself in his strange language. Minutes melted into hours and she moved to settle against the far wall of the tree. He glanced briefly in her direction when she moved. Then returned to his brooding. Time crawled. For a while, she counted how many footsteps it took him to get from one side of the tree to the other. Then, she tried to see a pattern in his markings. She was beginning to wonder if they changed color with his mood. At the moment, they had faded back to a deep midnight blue, tendrils of a lighter blue-green twining through it. In an eerie way, they were pretty. It was frustrating to watch him determine the rest of her life. The light had vanished from the inside of the tree and the leaves above were burnished gold when he finally stopped. She watched him pivot, one hand still on his chin in thought. He stepped forward and tapped his chin, eyes holding hers. She swallowed, waiting. Time froze. Finally, he nodded. You live, imprint. Publication date. March 18, 2011. All rights reserved.